It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming along. I was saying to someone earlier, if you were at George Thomas's talk last month, I really regret being number 2 in the sequence. Following George, I'd rather follow a global aphasic. He's a very tough act to follow. It was a really terrific talk, so I will just try to keep up to the standard that George set. So as Magda said, what I'd really like to talk to you about today is, as she said, what happens when language is lost. And in particular, what I'll be talking about are acquired brain injuries and nonverbal autism. And this slide very conveniently gets rid of the thank yous to the various funding agencies that have supported some of this work. And I'll go right into a whole bunch of truisms. So I apologize that some of these things are really obvious, but I think just to set the groundwork, I think the first issue is that language frames our thinking. It's really what we're about. So it frames our mental life. You could argue it's the default building material for all the other cognitive processes. And I say that with due respect to a variety of people in this room, including my wife who studies memory, but it's all still based on language. It's all not based on motor skills, thank God. There we go. Arguably, language is the foundation of our species' success. It underlies all that we do as individuals, groups, and societies. As Magda said, when you visit another country, if you don't speak the language, you are disadvantaged. I remember being in St. Petersburg, the Russian one, not the Floridian one, and it wasn't even a case of speaking the language. I couldn't even read the orthography. And again, my wife said to me at the time, she said, "Welcome to dyslexia." So it was really a challenge, and so language is really fundamental. And it's also, though, given its fundamental aspects, it's the route that we could take to access somebody's mental life. So again, if you visit a physician, for example, she or he will say, "So what's wrong?" And immediately a dialogue begins as to what's wrong. How often have you had these symptoms? So is it better in the morning, better in the evening, etc.? You know, what do you think is going on? It's without this, and that's really what I'll be speaking about, without this, you are immediately and potentially catastrophically compromised, because you cannot communicate what is going on. And typically, they are not able to access anything that you're doing, anything that you're thinking. So what happens when it abandons us? What happens when language leaves? What happens to our thinking, our mental life, our interpersonal relations? And much more to the point, what happens to people's opinions of us? It's one thing what we might be experiencing when we lose language. What happens when people visit us? What happens when we really can't communicate anymore? And what's particularly scary is what happens when people who are now all of a sudden responsible for us, again, physicians, various healthcare professionals, what happens when we can't speak to them? What's their opinion of us? And that is somewhat rhetorical, because I think many people know what happens. So this is one scenario, which maybe I'll read because it's not very user-friendly the way it's printed up here. But this is actually, I took it from one of the grants that I wrote with colleagues, and it was just a scenario of really partially what a patient said to me one time, and he did say it to me because we'll talk about him in a little bit. But it's made slightly dramatic here. So what it is saying is, suddenly you're awake. Alert to your surroundings, you become aware of bodily pain and nausea, and the brightness of sunlight streaming through the window and the loudness of a nearby TV. Gradually, you realize you're in a hospital bed and that you are unable to move. From the way the nurse ignored you, you also realize that you can't speak or do anything to indicate that you are aware of your surroundings. They all think that you're effectively dead, in a vegetative state. And the way everyone ignores you, they might as well be right. You overhear the doctor telling your family that you're gone. Only your body is alive, and therapy is not sensible as you can no longer think or understand. He says that you may remain in this state for several years, but you'll die slowly of multiple organ failure. You listen, you understand, but you can't communicate by moving, speaking, or even blinking. You want to scream, "I'm here," but you can't, and you can only listen to what they think they know and their footsteps as they walk away from you. So part of this is based on the writing down, because he never regained speech, but of a patient that we evaluated a number of years ago. So I'll be not speaking about a bunch of brain imaging tools. I'll be speaking about one of them, but just to try to put it in some sort of context, because I don't want to make any assumptions about what people do and don't know here. So just quickly, there are three, one would argue two, but let's for the moment say three major brain imaging tools that are available for general cognitive neuroscience. The first one is magnetic resonance imaging, and that's what you can see here. So the subject, it looks strange to me in this, okay. It looks compressed. This is not a child one. Looks longer on my screen here. But this is a bed that a patient would lie down on. Their head goes into the head bore here, and then the whole device slides into this large magnet. And you can do very sophisticated anatomical images of the brain, and you can also do very sophisticated, a whole variety of functional measures of brain activity. So you can measure what areas of the brain are active, what areas are not active, and what areas may be dysfunctional. And there's a whole range of things. It's changing almost annually in terms of the number of things that you can do here. And for example, the MRI device that we use in this city is at St. Joseph's Hospital. It's a 3 Tesla magnet. It's for research only, and that's a fairly high field magnet, so it's very nice equipment. And this is the sort of picture that you get from it. This is one of my graduate students, a doctoral student, Angela Harrison, doing mental arithmetic, which, thankfully, as she's a doctoral student, she's demonstrating that in point of fact, she can do. So this is, you can see the clarity, first of all, of the anatomical aspect of this image. You can see the cerebellum, brainstem. You can see it's absolutely spectacular what you can see anatomically. And then what we do is we then have a separate imaging procedure where we look at blood oxygen levels. And it's called BOLD, so blood oxygen level dependent responses. And they are paramagnetic, and you can pick them up in the machine. And then you just overlay that activity, as long as everybody lies still, or the subject lies still, and you can get these images. Then you overlay those images onto the really beautiful image of the brain, and you can then get this localization of brain activity. So this is just demonstrating that Angela can do arithmetic. So she remains in the program. Now this is something called magnetoencephalography, and this is a device in Helsinki, and effectively they are the people that really started this entire field of work. It was associated with a low temperature lab, and that's because this really is very dependent, as is the previous device, on low temperatures. So you have a whole series of sensors in this, along with liquid helium. And anytime helium is liquid, it means it's cold. So there are a collection of squids, they're called, so superconducting quantum interference devices, that are in here that are measuring this person's magnetic fields in their brain. So that's, again, very nice equipment. As you can tell both from the previous slide and from this slide, this equipment is not portable. It's also spectacularly expensive. So both systems are in the $5 million range. Very difficult, or not difficult, very expensive. I think of that as difficult these days. Very expensive to maintain and keep operating. And also they're not very common, even MRIs, but especially MEG devices. They are not that commonly available because of the price. And you don't just buy the equipment, you need a whole staff to run it. So we use this. It is the oldest technique, discovered 50 or 60 years ago. Well, not discovered 50 or 60 years ago, it was discovered really in humans around 1929. A man named Hans Berger in Germany. It was being done in animals, and he thought, well, this should work in humans, and he demonstrated that was the case. He probably couldn't do that. He wouldn't get ethics permission. He put his feet in saline and attached electrical cables to his brain and avoided electrocuting himself and just recorded his EEG. So this is a very useful technique. It is relatively inexpensive. We have a very elaborate lab at Mac that cost about $500,000. So that is pretty cheap. We have a number of systems. And the thing is, arguably, we've always said it's the best tool for this particular job, which I'll talk about in a little while. And that was not getting any traction until recently, where all the fMRI people seem to be now saying, you know what's a really good technique is EEG. So EEG basically records brain electrical activity. The reason it's particularly good is it's very sensitive in the time domain. If you want to look at how quickly something is happening in the brain, how someone is processing and where they may hit a blockage in terms of they're doing something and then it stops, it's not that easy to do with the MRI technique. It's easy to do with the magnetoencephalography and the electroencephalography. They're very similar in that regard. Just one system costs $500,000, the other costs $5 million. So it's a relatively easy choice. These are the sorts of images that you can get from both MEG, the magnetoencephalography, and electroencephalography. And this is more or less like a weather map. This is showing you where there are various activities in the brain during a particular task. So I'm showing you this because it's the last time I'll show you this type of image, because I'm going to be showing you mostly the other type of image that we get from these recordings, these EEG recordings, and that's particular waveforms. And they're very important because they relate to certain cognitive functions in the brain, which is really what we care about. And in that regard, so EEG and MEG provide these particular signatures to what you are doing mentally. So this is a particular paradigm that we've used for a number of years, and some people have heard this so often that I can see they're lip syncing this part of the presentation. But these are different types of sentences that, as you can see, when you have a sentence like "the winter was harsh, this allowance," or "the pigs wallowed in the pen," these are types of sentences, and there's one more that should be here. "The gambler had a streak of bad luggage." These are types of sentences that, as you read them, you realize that except for, well, not except for anything, all of them have elements of unexpectedness. The first one is just flat out wrong. This one is not the way most people in North America finish that sentence. They finish it with "the pigs wallowed in the pen." Sorry, they say "the pigs wallowed in the mud." I finished it, or this experiment uses the word pen, which is semantically okay, just not quite expected. And then finally we had the last sentence, "the gambler had a streak of bad luggage." That's playing with the sound of the word. The initial sound of the word sounds like the word that should have ended that sentence, the word luck. But instead it goes terribly wrong and becomes luggage. So it becomes semantically incorrect, just not immediately so, unlike this example. All of this is simply to look at two elements of spoken word recognition: phonological processing, which you're all doing right now, and you're doing it as I speak. You're not waiting for pauses and then thinking, okay, what was that he just said? You are processing it as you hear me say it. So there's the phonology of this. So again, the Y sound instead of the A sound. So you're doing that as you hear someone say, "the winter was harsh, this allowance." The second you hear the it's sounding wrong. So the brain will respond to that. And then, of course, when you have something that's just semantically wrong, the brain will respond to that as well. Because in this experiment, of course, we had a condition where the sentences made perfect sense. He takes coffee with cream and sugar. So we then compare these three conditions with that other type of condition, and we had certain expectations in this experiment, and all I'm doing is just providing you an example of some basic linguistic language research using brain imaging, just to set the stage for what we will be talking about a bit later. Basically, what you see when you have sentences like this is that, let me get out of your way and over here, is that the first thing is you have some auditory processing early on here. And then the line that you see just drop right down like that, not doing much of anything except looking like the stock market in 2008, that this is processing a sentence that made perfect sense. This is a sentence such as, he takes coffee with cream and sugar. As a contrast, this one that goes up and has these two little bumps here, this is, the winter was harsh, this allowance. This is basically how you, by way of your brain, can tell when somebody is saying something sensible that you expected and something that isn't sensible. You can't do this. You either don't speak the language or you have some neurological issues. This sentence here, this line here, this is a type of EEG response. I'm happy to get techier for anyone that's interested, but I'll just avoid that for the moment. But this is a type of EEG response. This heavy line that you see here is the sentence that said the gambler had a streak of bad luggage. So you can see that this response shows this semantic response, but you can see it's a little bit delayed. In brain terms, it's hugely delayed. So that 60 milliseconds, which is about what that is a huge delay in terms of brain timing. And then finally, this sentence here, this line here that you can see is the pig swallowed in the pen. What's happening is the sound of a P is not what most people expect. So you get that phonology response, and then it drops off because the semantics are okay. So this is how you do all that stuff, and the real point in showing you this is that we can record it. We can watch someone do this. We can test one of you, and if you claim to speak Russian, we can present stimuli to you that will either confirm you speak Russian or demonstrate that you do not speak Russian. It's very simple. We do this if I were the subject, I do not speak Russian. You play this to me, I show the early sensory responses and then show not much. If we take Dr. Cooperman in the audience and we do this, he'll show all of this quite beautifully, even in Russian. So it's really a measure of how the brain is doing language. I mentioned this phonology response, and just to again familiarize you with how sensitive some of these measures can be, this is a test that's used clinically to evaluate, for example, children who have reading problems. So it's a phoneme deletion task. So very often a clinician will have a child sitting across the table from them, and they'll just run through a paradigm that will say, what is clap without the k, so the K sound? And you will see people who will not be able to do that. That they will give you different sorts of answers, or they'll just take a long time to try to give you that reply. And it's a very effective tool to looking at how is their phonological processing and encoding working. So this is something we adapted to be able to record their brain activity. So we made this a passive task. So instead, would they just hear this over headphones? And then they will hear one of the options. So clap without the K sound. They will hear lap, which is correct. They might hear cap, which is one of the common errors. They'll delete the wrong sound. They'll delete the consonant cluster at the front end, and they might say app. And then we just had an irrelevant word. Regular children don't do that, but we just needed that for experimental purposes. The bottom line is that what you see here is, again, basic auditory responding, and then at around 300 milliseconds, you see a phonological response that is responding uniformly. So it appears to be an all or none type of response for the physiologists amongst you. It's not a graded response. It's basically if it detects that there is a phonological error in this speech stream of what they've just heard, it just bangs out a response that's about the same size. And what's interesting is there is a secondary response. So this is, we think, related to an element of what's called the phonological loop within working memory. It's basically that you never stop processing this. It's not as if you do the phonology of the first sound you hear me make and you stop doing that. You're constantly doing it, and embedded in it in this particular lecture, I hope is, well, no, I hope there aren't the semantic anomaly responses, but nonetheless, you are doing semantics as well. Okay. And this response, if you're wondering why does this condition, why does the correct condition not show this? The correct condition you always get this response. It's very, very small in this situation. And this recognition response of what's the correct one, which is what that is, it's recognition memory, is huge. And it, in a sense, drowns out the very little but present phonological response that you are seeing there. So these measures, really what I'm getting at is these measures are very, very sensitive. And I'm becoming aware of the time. I'll skip over the next bit, but for those of you interested in homophones, as you can see here, we have some really beautiful data on homophones and basically how when you read, you are using a phonological system when you read, typically. I'll just skip that for the time being. Also because we're not doing it in any patients that we're testing. But anybody interested in homophones, feel free to ask me questions at the end of it. So if we return to EEG, this is a measure that we have found extremely useful, as I said, and we've been doing this work now for about 20 years. We tested the first patient diagnosed as being in a vegetative state about 20 years ago now. And this was a young man who was stabbed in the head. And I'll show you a scan of him in a second. But the issue here is, how should we define consciousness? How might we measure it? And what constitutes evidence for a disorder of consciousness? It's somewhat ironic that I've become involved in this sort of work because one of my very highly regarded professors when I was doing my PhD said 2 bits of advice, because I was in the psychology department and although I was doing physiology, he still said 2 bits of advice. Psychology was still floating around there on the periphery. He said, if you want any credibility in your career, do not go anywhere near personality research or studies of consciousness. Just stay away from them. And I succeeded for almost, well, a very long part of my career. And then I just fell off the wagon about 20 years ago. And we started looking at disorders of consciousness. The reason being that we really do have measures that do map consciousness at some level. And that's really what I'll be talking about. In terms of, there really is a patent for this, but in terms of making correct diagnoses, in this case there was a worry about diagnosing somebody as dead correctly. And there was a worry about that. And there are well-established cases of people who were buried accidentally. And this fellow patented and marketed a device to prevent premature burial. And basically, it was, if you can't see this, it's a little squeeze bulb that as you squeeze this, it rings a bell and waves a flag up and down. It always struck me that, well, this is good unless the person regains consciousness at about 3 in the morning and the graveyard is dark and empty and the flag's going up and down, the bell's ringing, and by the time the first shift of workers arrives, well, the bell is no longer ringing and the flag is no longer going up and down, which would be terribly disappointing. And they think everything's worked out fine. So right now, I just want to move on to the topic of acquired brain injury. And in 1994, there were 2 groups. There was a Royal Commission in England and also the US Multi-Society Task Force on Persistent Vegetative State, trying to come up with guidelines. They are more or less the same for both groups. The definitions of vegetative state are no evidence of awareness of self or environment and an inability to interact with others. No evidence of sustained, reproducible, purposeful, or voluntary behavioral responses to visual, auditory, tactile, or noxious stimuli. No evidence of language comprehension or expression. And then a whole bunch of other medical things that, frankly, I should delete from this slide. They're not that relevant. Those are the key ones, so I will. Those are the key ones. And just to emphasize what we're talking about here, this is a video. I want to emphasize that we have permission from family to show this video. This is a patient we tested a number of years ago. It may look as if both eyes are shut. That's not accurate. Both eyes are open. This man was in an automobile accident, was in a coma for about a month, had substantial reconstructive surgery to his skull. He was thrown from the vehicle when it hit a tree. And he was left in this state. His mother actually saw, he was not the first person we tested. His mother saw an article about our work in the Globe and Mail, as I recall. And so this was when I was still at Dalhousie in Nova Scotia. And she contacted us and said, would we be willing to test her son? We were willing, but it was about 3 years after the accident, and you can already see certain posturing that's the consequence of his injury and the duration of from the injury. And we did test him, and we tested him in some of the paradigms that I described to you, which is why I wanted you to get a bit of a feel for those particular paradigms. This is just a slide from a colleague in New York that is just, one can't improve on it, so I just asked him for it. And it is, so it's from Nico Schiff in New York, and this is just showing a quick example of what we're talking about here. So we can go from coma, and as we move to the right here, we're getting, we're approaching normal consciousness. So the cognitive function improves as we go to the right. As we go upward, so to speak, we're getting from a locked-in syndrome, which is not a disorder of consciousness. It means you're okay in terms of consciousness. You just can't do anything to show it. But your consciousness is okay. And what you can see is you can then get a full recovery. And this is everybody in this room, so everybody's normal. And this is the worst case scenario down here. So just to give you some metric or visualization of what we're really talking about here. And the justification for the methods that I'll be showing you, which is again testing someone like you saw in the video, testing him using electroencephalography or EEG, is that this type of measure that I was avoiding saying before, they're called evoked potentials. It's a type of EEG. These responses are used regularly in medicine, have been for decades, ever since they were discovered. These measure very discrete sensory functions. So, for example, when I was training, which tells you how long ago these were known, that you could look at someone's visual evoked potentials. And you could make, for example, a differential diagnosis between optic neuritis and multiple sclerosis very early on. That actually happened when I was doing my PhD in Queen Square in London. It was very exciting stuff. Because that's quite a different prognosis, obviously, and one you can treat, the other, unfortunately, you cannot. But nonetheless, it helped with the differential diagnosis. So evoked potentials, including, for example, brainstem auditory evoked potentials, you can record directly from the brainstem by just putting non-invasive electrodes on the head. You just put that cap on. And you can record all the way down to the most primitive parts of our brains. And again, a very useful technique for, it's one of the ways of determining brain death, for example. It's not just EEG, it's auditory brainstem responses, or these BAEP things, that if you don't show those, or if you show only the first two waveforms, then the general feeling is that, along with a few other criteria, then you are effectively dead. However, anytime you were admitted into hospital with some sort of head injury, they would do those early responses, but if they then wanted to know what shape you were in cognitively, these would tell you some elements of sensory response and basic function. But if you cared about, so does the person have any cognitive consequences to this injury, they would send you to a neuropsychologist for neuropsychological assessment. Now, I have many friends who are neuropsychologists. This is not saying that what they do is not useful. It absolutely is. In fact, my training is in the psychology department, and I did do a lot of neuropsychology. But the fact is that if you cannot communicate, which is what we're all about in this talk this evening, if you can't communicate in any fashion, you can't do any sensible neuropsychological assessment that you are willing to trust. But that's the situation you were in. So if you could not respond as the patient going up there, like the man we saw in the video, and another one I'll show you in a little while, if you can't respond, they can't do their job. Which means you're left with someone saying, well, he shows basic sensory responses, but there's nothing they can do. They can't evaluate anything further than that. We decided that about 20 years ago, as I said, or about 25 years ago, it took a while to do all the basic research, that we thought that this was a function. The reason people weren't looking at so-called cognitive evoked potentials was that the feeling was that they were not reliable enough. That these responses are extremely reliable. If I were to test all of you right now, say looking at your brainstem responses, and test you 1 year hence, assuming nothing dramatic has happened in that 1 year, your brainstem responses would look virtually identical 1 year from now compared to today. That is not true with cognitive evoked responses. It's just not true. If you think about it, why would it be true? You know yourself that you wake up in the morning and you're not at your best. Well, I'm not. I'm more an evening person. In the morning, it's like, I think it's terrifying that I'm allowed to drive to work. So it's just not at my best. Well, my cognitive evoked potentials would reflect that. It's a very fluid system, cognition, unlike the brainstem. You don't want a fluid brainstem. You want that thing ticking over like a Rolex. But cognition is very different. However, we thought we could constrain cognitive situations tightly enough that we could get very reliable cognitive responses within a certain time frame, within a certain experimental paradigm, within a certain setting. And what we did was look to neuropsychology. Very good tests. So we just basically adapted neuropsychological tests for computer presentation and simultaneous EEG recording. And the idea was that if you can't move, can't speak, can't even blink, that to any command, that we could let the brain, in a sense, do the talking. That the stimuli that within a neuropsychological test that we would present to you, that we would let your brain respond to it. Because after all, you might say, oh, I know the answer to that. Well, you only do that because your brain has preceded that behavior by having some type of response to it, to the stimulus. So this is a case of basically letting the brain do the talking when all the other equipment that you have is failing you. So it's basically, neuropsych tests have a reliance on language and communication, and we're trying to bypass that. So it's a standard neuropsychological assessment test. We've adapted them, as I said, for computer presentation, simultaneous EEG recording. It's a real-time measure. EEG can be a real-time measure of a whole range of, as I said, sensory perceptual and cognitive functions. Speech processing, reading, comprehension, attention, memory, concept formation, expectancy. You can watch somebody waiting for a stimulus to happen if they know it's going to. So the sensitivity of these measures to a variety of cognitive functions is really spectacular. Also critically important, after all, given what we're targeting here, is that it's not dependent, these brain responses are not dependent on any overt behavior. You don't have to say, oh, I speak Russian. We'll be able to tell. Equally, it means that you don't have to say, because you cannot, I'm actually comprehending speech. We'd be able to tell. We just hook you up and we play speech to you. If you respond to it, because your parents have said, she speaks English, then we would play English stimuli. If you respond to them, to those stimuli I showed you, and you show brain responses to those indicating you're processing, well, we've basically started an assessment procedure for you. And the brain responses can then substitute for behavior. If you can't respond in behavior, well, these can take care of that. And the other thing I've already mentioned, valuable clinical information, it's also, all things considered, relatively cheap. This is a fellow, he was actually the first adult that we tested. He was a young male, he had average premorbid functioning. He was stabbed in the head during an altercation that was not of his making. Not that that would matter, but it wasn't. The entry wound, so we're looking at him, his images, from his feet, so to speak. So this is the left side of the head. The knife entered this area, entered right around here, right around the temple area. For those of you neuroanatomically inclined, more or less entered right around Broca's area. So it went in at that point, really caused catastrophic brain damage, and he was left in a vegetative state. We saw him in Halifax, and we presented stimuli to him because, again, what happened was he was admitted. They did some basic sensory responses with him. They were okay, not great, but they were okay. Not the visual, but some of the auditory was, so he had hearing, which is important for what we were interested in. But my neuropsychologist colleague said, I can't do anything with him. He's in a vegetative state. So he could not move, could not blink to command, could not sit upright in his wheelchair because he had no muscle tone. He had swallowing reflex problems. So he was like the person you saw in the video, just none of the posturing because we saw him a matter of weeks after he had been assaulted. We tested him, and this again is something I showed you earlier, but just to push this so you understand what I'm talking about. These are sentences that make sense, that are going down here. Different paradigm, but it's the same idea. You can see how they go down here, and this is what happens. They stay up or they go even bigger if something is not right. These are this young man's responses. This is first time around, this is later. And basically, what you can see here, the black line is to incongruous or inappropriate sentences. You can see right around that same time frame. He's a bit late, but after all, he has sustained a very serious brain injury. But you can see very clear responses here that are very different. So this is the blue line is a sentence that makes sense, his response to it. The black line is a response to sentences that don't make sense. And you can see on this side, with a little bit later in time, now the response is becoming much more robust and looking much more like a group of Dalhousie undergraduates. So this is somebody who was still showing signs, even at this testing, of some serious brain injuries and was still receiving a diagnosis of vegetative state. And this was indicating that he was absolutely not in a vegetative state, that he was engaged in semantic processing. He was doing some very sophisticated language work inside his head. The physicians I worked with decided that this was in the early 90s. They decided that they weren't entirely sure what this guy was talking about, meaning me, but they were willing to have a go. They did do with him what was already officially denied. He had to discharge papers to go home, and the prognosis was, of course, not good. But they decided not to discharge him. They did standard rehab. I have nothing to do with treatment. What's currently available out there is absolutely terrific. What happened was he became eligible for it by virtue of these results. And he responded wonderfully well. So that about 4 or 5 months later, he walked out of hospital with a temporary multi-point cane. He was back to playing video games with his brother. It's ironic because at that time we just thought, well, that seems to be helping him. That's good. Now it's a part of treatment to engage in video games. We should have patented that thing too. So at any rate, but his brother, who was younger, was having a field day because he was beating his older brother for the first time in his life. So when his brother was still quite disabled, but his brother started to make recovery. So this young man went home. The one thing, as far as we know, because we lost contact with him, the one thing we know, the last we heard, he had all his functions back except for speech. As far as we know, he never did recover speech, the production of it. So another person, and again, we have permission to show this, and also this person is going to be on television quite soon. Global TV has done a segment or a program about some of this work. I really don't know when it airs. It's on a program called 16 by 9, which I have to admit I'm not familiar with, but it's on Global TV. It's sometime this month. I'm sorry, I don't know more than that. But this is a fellow that was in a motor vehicle accident, and I'll just cut this short because I am aware of time. But this is a man that was in a motor vehicle accident. He was actually on a bicycle. It was hit by a car. And this is the state at which he was left. Diagnosis by a terrific neurologist we were working with when I first came to Hamilton, who has since died. Really, it's a huge loss personally and professionally, but Dr. Jane Gillette. This was one of her patients, and she made the diagnosis of vegetative state. It was quite unequivocal, and we tested him, and what you can see here again is these are responses to sentences. And if we just concentrate in the part of the head where these responses are dominant, so we tested this man when he was in that sort of state, and what you can see here are those semantic responses. We tested him on 3 different occasions, and you can see there is no real difference in those semantic responses, indicating that even from the very beginning, and he also has made slow recovery, but he is still recovering. So the idea of what you see is what you get after 6 months or even 1 year, not necessarily true. So it's now been about 2 years out, and he's still showing improvement. He is getting extensive treatment. But the bottom line is that we said actually he isn't, and he went into Dr. Gillette's Slow to Recover program, and he started responding after a certain period of time. Interestingly, his first speech was not speech at all, it was singing. There was a birthday on the ward, and he had not said a word. We were still testing him, claiming he was still in there, and he was not showing many signs of it. And during this birthday celebration, when they sang happy birthday, all of a sudden he joined in. So we got some quick texts from people saying, guess what? And then from singing, he went into speech, and for the program, we tested him recently, and his speech is still quite problematic in terms of articulation, but he is speaking, and he's in the process of learning to walk again. So this is quite a different case from what was the initial diagnosis. Now, Dr. Gillette knew what was up. That's why she said, I've tested him, he is vegetative, what do you say? She knew exactly what this was about. But in a normal run of things, a consensus diagnosis, which by the way can be wrong, consensus diagnosis means a couple of physicians look at a patient behaviorally and say, that's vegetative state, and then they move on. There are 3 different studies, one very recently out of Belgium, indicating that that diagnosis can be wrong as much as 43% of the time. That's huge. And that's just on the basis, that comparison of 43% is not based on this imaging data. It's based on other behavioral, more sophisticated behavioral assessment. So what these would add to that is really not known at this stage, but it's probably another 20 or 30% are still being misdiagnosed, even with this really much improved behavioral assessment tool. So quickly, I'll just mention also, we tested patients using something called the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test. I'm going to be showing you responses from the same man I showed you just most recently in the video. But the way this works, the way we've adapted it, let me put it that way, is that you see a picture like a school bus, and you will hear the word bus, or you'll hear the word dog. And what happens is, if you hear the word dog, you will show a huge response, as you can see there, again, a semantic anomaly response. It's your brain recognizing that's not correct. And this is if you hear the word bus. And there are different levels of vocabulary. That's all that's talking about. And this is a group of undergraduates at an unnamed university that I used to be at. And this is level 1. These are words like dog. This is words like furious. These are more difficult words. These, I'm blanking on an example, but these are words like pedagogue and homunculus. So fairly sophisticated. And I will say these were first-year students. So what you can see is they're showing incongruous brain responses to all of them, because who knows is the response. And I did suggest to one of the vice presidents, VP academic, I said, we could always use this as a criterion for graduation. He was less enthused than I. But when we tested this same man I showed you in the video with this procedure, what you can see here, let's just pick this. You can all see it. I'm aware that some of these are quite low for people in the back. What you can see here is this, let's pick this one as an arrow. This one you can see that 2 of the 3 test occasions, he showed an appropriate response to when he saw a school bus, for example, and heard the word dog. One of those occasions, and it's the middle occasion, something went wrong. He did not show a response. As you can see here, the red line just sort of floats along. What happened was, we were aware of how tired he was getting. We tried to speed up the stimulation. Bad idea. We got negative results, which actually was useful. It told us that these are not random responses to language-like stimuli. He was semantically processing the picture and the word. And when it went too fast for him, he couldn't do it. And now that he's speaking, when we did speak to him about that, he said, yeah, it was pretty fast. Not quite, I admit, as articulately as that. But he was totally tuned in. So what can we conclude from this? Receptive language functions were retained in the 2 patients that I showed you. It doesn't mean that they're retained in all the patients we test. Sometimes the patient is in a vegetative state. Receptive language abilities improved over time, so we can use these techniques to monitor someone over time. Some of those responses did improve. The last person I showed you did not, because he was already at maximum. He was doing just fine despite his catastrophic injuries. Also, the observed responses are sensitive to basic stimulus parameter manipulations, and that's really important. So these are not, as I've just finished saying, generalized non-specific responses to language. He's really doing something. He is processing this linguistically. And then the other thing, and this is a slightly techie point, but sometimes people, and we work with a philosophy person, so I'm not getting, and she may be in the audience, I can't tell, but philosophers who are essential to this work, if you want to try to understand consciousness, and frankly a much more sophisticated view of it than neuroscience has at the moment. But nonetheless, this is a techie issue about whether we're really looking at consciousness or can you do some of this automatically, because there's anecdotal evidence from the literature that people can, in very strange states, for example, even under general anesthetic, show some quick responses. They can follow instructions. If during surgery the person is moving an arm, someone may say, stop moving your arm. And depending on the depth of anesthesia, of course, you may get a response that looks like, well, they're following instructions, in which case probably the anesthetist will be glared at by the surgeon and begin his work again. But nonetheless, all the waveforms I showed you, the person had to do that task for us to be able to see those brain activities, those brain responses. He or she had to do that response repeatedly to a number of different stimulations. So it's not just a one-off, oh, you never know what might have happened then. This is a consistent package of responding and listening to these stimuli. So this is really reflecting some type of conscious activity, which gets back to the issue of what constitutes evidence in that slide I showed you earlier. What constitutes evidence of language comprehension? If that's what's being used as a diagnostic, a behavioral diagnostic for vegetative state, it's no evidence of willful behavior, no evidence of language processing. Well, this is evidence. And there's also evidence from about several other labs in the world doing this sort of work from techniques including fMRI. I don't think people have done MEG for obvious clinical reasons, but basically given the clinical criteria outlined earlier, this is consciousness. So again, I keep saying it, I am aware of the time, but one of the groups that we've looked at more recently, because someone who is interested in autism research heard about the work I've just described to you and said, would you look at nonverbal autism? Because this, first of all, nonverbal autism represents about 25% of children diagnosed with autism, so it's not a small population. And the nonverbal, they run into the same issue. Especially in the US, it was Americans that contacted me. And especially in the US, where they will be at the age of, I believe it's 7, if they still have that diagnosis, they are not eligible for certain types of treatment and certain types of insurance. So it means that that diagnosis, unless the parents are independently wealthy, as were the people that contacted me, these children are going to be compromised because, again, they're not eligible for the treatment. Now, we did a lot of I'll just skip that. I've just described that slide. And these are just some examples of, you can certainly do this work. We know that children can semantically comprehend even if their behavior doesn't reflect it. They do know you said don't do that. That's a whole other issue. And this is the typically developed child, 11-year-old male, listening to the sentences that I was playing to you. So not even made age appropriate. These are some of these sentences that I was showing you earlier. And this child is showing very nice N400 activity that you can see very much there. Semantic responses. So he's showing semantic comprehension to those sentences and differentiating what is okay and what is not okay. And you can see that he's doing it over here as well. If you're wondering why some sites it shows it less, that's why we record up to 128 channels of EEG. Certain parts of the brain do this work, other parts don't. So it's a case of you record everywhere looking for this response because it might be abnormal in someone, for example, not a typically developed child, but it might be abnormal in somebody with brain injury or someone with autism. So we look everywhere we can. So this was a young girl, 11-year-old. She came to us more or less with a parental warning or a fellow clinician warning that she had knocked the tooth out of a therapist just days before. with a headbutt. So she was nonverbal, autism, capable of aggressive behavior, and capable of really executing a headbutt spectacularly well. And so we were a little bit worried. She was absolutely fine to work with. And more to the point, what she showed was very nice N400 activity to those sentences. So she was 11 years old, and she's showing responses very much like the typically developed child, despite the fact that her diagnosis is nonverbal autism, and what I have failed to say, that more or less always comes with the additional diagnosis of low functioning. Once again, not really going to be amenable to any sort of intervention, not really able to be changed. So this is what you've got. Sorry. Well, not necessarily, at least in terms of semantic comprehension. This little girl was processing relatively complex sentences. And this is another child who is also showing N400 semantic responses. It's called the N400. I'm trying to avoid those terms. So you can see, and again, toward the back of the head, which is very typical. So very nice responses from this child. This is another nonverbal autistic child, again, showing very nice responses. And I'm sorry, I misspoke. Those other two slides with that same little girl. This is now the second slide of another subject. This is now a child who is not showing that response. So once again, this is not it's looking at some non-specific response. This is a child diagnosed as nonverbal who is at least not showing any receptive language functions, at least in terms of the measures that we use. And another case of, you may say, well, that looks different, but it's not reliable. It's not a reliable response. Okay, so I'm almost done. So the combination of highly constrained neuropsychological tests like the Peabody, the PPVT, the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, and these EEG recordings, they provide a clear, I think, value-added methodology for assessing nonverbal, non-communicative people, be they children or adults. Also, for acquired brain injury and autism, purely behavioral assessments risk misjudging the cognitive capacity of the person with potentially dire consequences. It could be argued, we've had conversations with Health Canada, and introduction of some type of neuromonitoring methodology as a standard assessment tool for the difficult to assess patient could be considered overdue, some of us think. Finally, consciousness, self-consciousness, awareness are concepts that can't reliably be differentiated at the moment with these techniques, but just like with fMRI, it seems every year there's a new method to look at some other activity in the brain. This is active research, so we'll see if that situation changes. So, and finally, what do patients say when they've been tested? Well, some of them, for example, the fellow that was stabbed in the head, remembered vividly us testing him. The very first occasion, he remembered it absolutely vividly. In fact, I was so surprised at that given his state. He was the first person I ever saw in that state. I had this theory that I wanted to look at people like this, and I have to admit, when I saw him, I thought, well, this is a waste of time, which was somewhat ironic given this is what I claimed I was wanting to test. But when you see someone like this, it really looks like it's a waste of time. So I kept asking him, really, you could, and he had to write his replies, but he just wrote back, wrote on, I kept saying, so you really can remember that first time? And he looked and finally said, he just wrote down, don't you believe your own tests? So I stopped asking him. So in terms of areas of application, there are a fair number of them. Stroke, dementia, is relevant in terms of competency, but also differential diagnosis of depression and dementia. That's an issue. Malingering and detection of deception. I haven't mentioned that at all, but except that, for example, if the aforementioned Dr. Cooperman, sorry, I'm picking on you, but if Victor wanted to deny that he was Russian for some reason, I'm just saying, that that we could wire him up and play him Russian sentences, and it doesn't mean he's guilty of anything, it's just except denying that he comprehends Russian. We would be able to see that. So as I say when I used to lecture about this stuff to students, if you are guilty and they say they're going to do lie detection and they say they're going to record what they still call galvanic skin response and heart rate, I tell students, take the test. You never know your luck. It's a really inaccurate method. So roll the dice, because they might have other, they might actually be able to use other techniques like evidence and convict you. So take the test, because your lawyer can keep saying, she passed the lie detection test. Then I just say, if they say, oh, we don't do that, we're going to put electrodes on your head, don't worry, it won't hurt. I said, just confess. It'll save time. So it's a very reliable tool. So coma, vegetative states, ICU monitoring. One of my students, Richard Ma, who I can see back there, he's unnecessarily tall, so he just looms over everybody. In fact, that's the tall section of the audience I see. So ICU monitoring and coma work. So Richard and I are going to be doing some research on coma patients. Anesthetic state, I have a postdoc who's Canadian. She's kind of here, but she's mostly in Michigan, at Ann Arbor, University of Michigan. And so on the 29th, we're getting together. She's coming out with a colleague at Michigan, and we're going to talk about looking at measures like this to assess general anesthetic state. Because I won't get into the issue of consciousness and awareness during surgery. You really don't want to know. Autism, we've talked about. Rett syndrome is like autism, but mostly little girls. So that's another area where, again, communication is severely compromised, but it's not clear really what the cognitive state of these people is. And then CP, that was a group we tested some spastic quadriplegic cerebral palsy children back in Halifax when I was still there. And again, a communication issue. And again, it was interesting. The first adult we tested was the fellow that was stabbed in the head. And the first spastic quadriplegic little girl we tested, or child we tested, little girl, showed wonderful responses. Her mother kept saying, she's very sophisticated. I've been teaching her. She watches Sesame Street, et cetera, et cetera. And understandably, the medical community looks at a child like this and says, there's just nothing going on. And this little girl showed very clear brain responses to the stimuli. We'd adapted something called the Columbia Aptitude Test. She did extremely well on this. She then did get treatment. And the last I heard, she admitted into St. Mary's University because she did get the treatment. She learned how to use it. I think it's called a bite bar, but you tap computer screens and that sort of thing. So her life really was different because the therapies that were out there were made available to her, and she responded terrifically well. And then, of course, any Canadian will know concussion is a huge issue. This was a terrifying thing for all Canadians. That is, if you can't read the jersey, Sidney Crosby. It's, suffering a concussion. And concussion has become, now it's being called what it is, which is a mild traumatic brain injury that may not stay mild if you get several of them. So this is another project I'm involved with colleagues in the med school and faculty of science, et cetera, where we're developing a concussion protocol and a project. So in the case of what is the future, there's a whole range. I'll just put these up here. I thought they popped up. So pain levels in non-communicative people. We did some work with infants. It looks like we may start that work again. So there's a whole range of applications, including brain-computer interfacing, which has been very exciting and controversial lately in somebody in Canada doing this work, somebody in New York criticizing it, and some poor innocent in Hamilton being asked to comment on it. So it's very cutting-edge research, but as some people describe it, it's really not cutting edge so much as bleeding edge. You can make mistakes. So BCI is, which is what this is very, very promising. And engineers have been doing this in some ways for almost 40 years of getting EEG to control peripheral devices. Jim Riley here at engineering, some of his students used EEG to control a wheelchair. So it's very doable. It's very sophisticated, very, very difficult. And you have to get beyond the trick stage. This isn't a case of, oh, this is cool, watch this. These are patients. So this is somebody you can really help them. So find a useful technique for this, which, like Jim controlling a wheelchair, this work is really very promising. This is a quote from a book I highly recommend, Jean-Dominique Bauby, The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. That's the English title. It's written in French, for those of you who want to read it in the original. He was the editor-in-chief of Elle magazine. He suffered a brainstem stroke, and brainstem strokes leave you in his case, what appeared to be a vegetative state. And this was one of his quotes. As you can see for yourself, does the cosmos contain keys for opening my diving bell? So it was le scaphandre et le papillon, and he was basically his mind, his spirit was the butterfly flying around inside this inflexible device, which was now his body. And because what happened with him is that a nurse noticed he was in a vegetative state in a palliative care center in northwest France. Basically, nobody had assessed him. They said, well, he's done. A nurse thought he might have been watching her with his one good eye. The other eye was sutured shut because it wouldn't blink. And so she went back to him and said, were you watching me? Blink twice for yes, once for no. And he blinked yes. Do you know where you are? Yes. Do you know what's happened to you? Yes. So they wrote a book together on a blink system. So she would just start saying the alphabet and he'd blink. And that would be the first letter of the first word of the book. And he wrote this book that his friends said was really beautiful for them to read, because despite his appearance, which he talks about in the book as well, which is, if you think this is really a depressing book, there are parts of it that are simply laugh out loud funny. The man was a character. And there's some very poignant parts of it, but this is one of the points where he's saying, does the cosmos contain keys for opening my diving bell? A subway line with no terminus? A currency strong enough to buy my freedom back? We must keep looking. Now, I think from the feeling one gets reading his book, that he would not want that to be a final quote for him. So I do think one must include that if I must drool, I may as well drool on cashmere. So he was really quite a character, and the people that knew him said that he was thoroughly intact in terms of his personality. Everything was still there. His memories, everything, despite his appearance. So anytime you go out, wear your helmet. It's a dangerous world out there. It won't protect you from everything, but it's a good start. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John, for your really inspiring and thought-provoking talk. The only disturbing element was this research on detection of deception. I can imagine employment insurance people using your tools.
Yes.
Any questions?
Nikolai.
I'm wondering if you know whether our brain produces the same responses to spoken stimuli when we are asleep. So if a team of researchers is doing these testing this method on a patient who fell asleep at the wrong time, would it be possible for them to mistake that person as being in a vegetative state? My real interest in this question comes from the fact that I am a father of a baby who hasn't slept for the first year of life. And I developed a spectacular ability. My brain can process speech when I'm asleep. And I can also produce a spoken, a verbal response sounding perfectly awake. But 3 hours down the road, I have no idea that I said or heard anything. So probably it's processing something, but not deeply enough for me to remember.
No, that's actually a really relevant question. There's a couple of, as some of the people in the audience will know, the first issue is that we can tell if someone's asleep because you are the bane of our existence. You'll, as you go into sleep state, you'll start to show alpha. That's when we come in the room, and I would tell you what we do, but in case one of you is on the ethics board, there's no way I'm going to tell. We go in and wake you up gently with a stick. And so it's extremely annoying. So you show this wave-like activity that indicates you're falling asleep or you have fallen asleep. So there'd be that. But it's a very important question that And the answer is no. Just to cut to the chase, you are more awake than you think. And what's happening is you're failing to store memories. I say that with some trepidation, knowing there's at least a couple of memory experts here. But at least the current thinking is you can do some of that, but you're not storing it. It's like at one level of awareness, you're on autopilot to some degree. But certainly as you go into sleep, a lot of these responses certainly the cognitive ones, just begin to disappear. There's a debate about other types of components that look at very low level attention, that some people claim in certain sleep states, you still can see it. And these are just I think it's kind of an interesting topic, so I'll pursue it just if I can for a second. There's a thing called a mismatched negativity. That's not important. What it's doing is it's detecting things. Your brain is always doing things that you're not aware of. Like the brainstem response I mentioned, I could play you what sounds like, if I said, what was that? You'd say, well, it's just a continuous tone. Your brainstem would know differently. It was a high frequency. It was a very rapidly repeating click stimulus. But it sounded just like, but it was a click. Your brainstem knew, but the rest of you didn't. In a similar way, for example, this is an annoyingly quiet room, but you might hear that projector, some of you, and now you do hear it before you might not have. Now it's going to drive you crazy. But the real issue is that your brain was processing that, because if that turned into something that changed in a way that made you nervous or made you worried, it would then transmit a signal of, this is not just background. This is why you wake up to your daughter. It's because you're tuned into that. There'll be things that previously, possibly, if I'm any judge, you would not wake up to a car bomb outside. I used to live in London when a certain group was active there, so it's a relevant issue. But nonetheless, I actually did sleep through one that wasn't that far away. And next day I said, there was a car bomb, over by Hammersmith. So at any rate, you could sleep through that. When my son was born, he'd roll over in his cot in the next room, and I'd be, waking up. So it's just our mismatch detectors changed. There was something that was salient then. So it'll disappear as you go into sleep. No, you sleep, you're toast for about 25 years. The sleeping that she'll start to do, but then there'll be other issues. So good luck. Yeah.
Well, I think it's absolutely fascinating that you can measure semantic processing of language. Do you think it would be possible to come up with similar methodology of measuring response to visual imagery?
I'm picking up on the word imagery. Certainly visual stimuli, you can do that. For example, I did not talk about the homophone work, so that's reading text. We can certainly do that. If you mean, given that I know what you do for a living, aesthetic judgments of paintings and that sort of thing, some people have looked at responses like that of what's pleasing and what's not pleasing. And given that anything neuro, is highly fashionable these days, there's now there's companies, for-profit companies, talking about neuromarketing. And they have huge backing, and that's one of the things they're really looking at. What grabs your attention? What is aesthetically pleasing? And again, the techniques they're looking at include a range of these, but EEG is one of the huge ones. Yeah. Yes?
My question is along the same line. I was wondering whether there are studies done like this on patients whose native language is not so phonetically based. I'm particularly thinking of Chinese characters that are more pictograms.
Yeah. Well, first of all, we tend to do all or most of our work in the auditory modality because we can't trust that the person will keep their eyes where we want them, in other words, where we're presenting visual stimuli. So I don't truthfully know of any work that's been done in tonal languages, for example. But in terms of doing visual stimuli, a lot of times we collectively avoid that for the reason of you don't know if they're looking. And even if they're looking, you can, for example, I can be looking at you, but noticing that Victor's just moved hand up to his face. There we go. So I might really be looking at you, but really paying attention to something else altogether. Whereas if you put ear inserts and present auditory stimuli, it's very difficult to avoid that. So, but really, no, I don't know any work that's done that in patients. Certainly, we've done work with our Chinese colleagues here at Mac and some of my undergraduate students who happen to be Chinese on Chinese reading, etc. So we've done that sort of work, but not in patients. And we avoid, like I say, avoid visual stimuli in patients.
So
Yeah.
even with normal people, do you get the same kind of delay response if there's a discrepancy?
Oh, yes. Sorry, do you mean like that semantic response? Will it? Oh, yeah. Everybody here would show that if we picked your primary language or even secondary language. Oh, everybody here would show that response. It is very, very robust. Yeah, it's a very reliable response. Yes?
Did you do any studies of brain activities in people who communicate with sign languages?
This is a very good advert for the young woman who I showed her brain doing arithmetic. She can not only do arithmetic, but she's a doctoral student who is doing exactly that. So she has done her master's, and it's a huge project, but we're looking at people with deaf subjects and normally hearing subjects, and we're going to be looking at ASL as well. We don't have any results, really, that I'd want to talk about in any detail, but it's a very good topic. And there is a literature out there, I should say. I think we're doing things that are adding to that literature. That's the idea. But certainly there's work out of California by a woman named Ursula Berlugi, that has looked at those sorts of things. And the issue is, yes, if you make an ASL semantic error or a semantic anomaly, you see brain responses much like I've shown you. The same system does it. It's localized the same way, so it's done in the same area of the brain. That's the area of the brain that does this. And when I say that, I don't really mean it's a specific area, because all of this stuff is networked. If anybody tells you, oh, this is the brain area that does this, and it's any kind of elaborate cognitive function, then they just mean they're either just wrong, or they mean that it's one of the major nodes of it, because all of this stuff is networked. The fact that you can ask a question in English means it's not just that you know English and this area is doing it, it's that you have a memory for English, and that you are then employing that memory to then execute a proper sequence of words, etc. So it's very complex stuff. But yes. Yeah.
In regards to your test of semantic congruence and your conclusion that those require consciousness.
Yep.
Now, is it just a presupposition of yours without empirical demonstration that actually consciousness is required for those tasks to occur? Or might it instead be that consciousness and cognitive processing go hand in hand, are correlated, but not causally connected, so that the cognitive process can, under some circumstances, go on without consciousness defined operationally as ability to describe what has gone on actually occurred. Because otherwise your conclusion that your results do demonstrate that the consciousness was involved would not be.
No, they wouldn't be valid, or that you'd need conditions to them.
Independent evidence that consciousness is required for this cognitive process.
Some of the sleep work demonstrates these responses just drop out as somebody goes into sleep. That would be one. There's studies with general anesthetics where, again, you keep some of the core responses, the very low-level attention responses, they tick over, although some argue that even they disappear. But certainly anything sophisticated, cognitive, They don't. They stop.
Those are not persuasive though, because those manipulations are gross enough in anesthesia or just falling asleep that they might not both processes simultaneously.
Yeah.
So you will not be able to.
Oh, I see. Okay, I see.
So what is required is some sort of falsification test where you actually try to dissociate the two.
Yeah.
And insofar as you never succeed and never succeed, you're proven the universal negative. Really.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if you can demonstrate that under some circumstances a dissociation occurs, then
Yeah, that dissociation is tricky to do, and
things like distraction tests, for example.
yeah.
During the process.
Well, certainly.
Can they do it?
That's right. Distraction tests, there isn't, I don't believe there's a great deal of work on this. I think there is an assumption that what I've said is like, well, that takes care of that, but you're absolutely right. But there are distraction tests which indicate that if you really are aware, there's like a visual gap. There's some great things on YouTube, if you're not familiar with them, of somebody told to count the number of times, I forget the exact instructions, but count the number of times that they pass a ball in a basketball game. And so you're meant to be counting this, and somebody walks across the screen dressed in a gorilla suit, and people don't recognize that. They say, so did you see did you see anything unusual? No, but there were 83 passes. No, but did you see anything unusual? No. You know, you didn't notice the guy in the gorilla suit standing in the middle of the court doing this? No, they really didn't. So there have been similar things of distracting people, and you can see that some aspects of the speech signal remain, but others don't. So I think, so that would be, but there's not a lot of work on that. So yeah, you're right, that I think we've taken that as good enough. But it'd be reasonable to do more work on that. Yeah.
For example, there are those experiments of masking
Yeah.
experiment, you know, so-called subliminal presentation experiment. They show that something actually is processed, even though the
That's right.
is not aware.
That's right.
That happened.
Yeah, usually that's not very sophisticated stimuli, though. That's the issue there. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a very important point, but there is work on some distraction. But even that, a lot of times there's a worry in that work of, like, if you have two streams of auditory input, you tell someone only pay attention to this. You can tell when somebody's sampling the other, even if it's just very quick. It's again like looking at one person and seeing Victor move his arm. It's just one of those things that you can be aware of it. So it's very tricky stuff.
I agree with you. It will require a lot of creative genius.
Yes, yes. Which I've got students back there that deal with that, right? George.
John, would I be right in assuming that you could use this technique to assess the comprehension of pre-verbal infants, not infants, pre-verbal, would it be possible then to do work on perhaps people who have been brought up in bilingual households, and so that you could assess how early it is that people are attaining comprehension in one or both of the languages?
Yeah, all of that's possible. In fact, I think the first study done on infants and vowel sounds was Finnish. And they had vowel sounds, they had Finnish infants and Estonian infants. And they heard each Finnish vowel sounds and Estonian vowel sounds. And the Finnish infants recognized the Estonian vowel. In other words, they showed that particular brain response indicating the rest was okay, but isn't that Estonian? And the Estonian children did the same, or infants did the same thing. So you can get some of those responses very early on. I think using that magnetoencephalography device, I believe that a group in Germany has done this with in utero of third trimester, because the magnetic signals are different than electrical signals for a variety of reasons. You can record them, but I think I'm right in that has been done. I know the lab I'm thinking of, I think they've done it, and I saw the in utero device at their facilities. So that, and that's what they were looking to do for this particular reason. Where does it really begin? And then, yes, you can track this. In fact, one of the students here, I think, in one of the classes recently was talking about aspects of that, of how soon can you measure this and can you track it? And the answer is you can do that. Yep.
What is the difference between magnetoencephalography and encephalography beyond the price? So what
And the name.
One can get for those 5 million, so one cannot get with EEG.
It's the magnetoencephalography is measuring the magnetic flux around the electroencephalography. So you have any electrical activity has a magnetic field around it. What the MEG, magnetoencephalography device, is measuring is the magnetic activity around all that EEG that I showed you. And what you get for that, so that's a nice trick. Good going. But what it gets you is that it gets you better spatial resolution as to where it's coming from. There is something called the inverse solution, where you work from like a magnetic or an electromagnetic field, and you try to work back where the signal came from. It would be, if you think of, not to get morbid here, but if you think of the Kennedy assassination, the Dallas one, where they're always talking about where would it have come from, you know, the different, if there are different shots, et cetera, et cetera. It's the same idea. If you have an electromagnetic field here that I've recorded from you in our lab, you can use, as I think you know, inverse solutions to try to work out where would the different generators have to be in the brain to produce that magnetic field. Now, also, as you and others may know, that solution is not unique, is the expression. In other words, you can have one set that explains it beautifully. You could theoretically have another set that explains it equally well. The trouble is, I think, that that's overstated frequently because some of them make no anatomical sense whatsoever. So I think it really is constrained by common sense. But when you're dealing with mathematics, well, common sense, you know, who needs it? So it's like some of it, I think, really is that's what it buys you anyway, to answer your question. It buys you better resolution there. And if you record both simultaneously, then you can get even, I think, better, well, many people think, better resolution, because the MEG device, the magnetic stuff, is blind to certain types of dipoles. So if the dipoles are radial, it won't see them, but the electrical signal does. So if you see it electrically but don't see it magnetically, it means the dipole must be gyral rather than sulcal. So, Magda.
You mentioned the possibility of application of this technology to the research on dementia. Have there been any results, or is this something that is a possibility?
It's certainly an area that's studied by all these techniques. In terms of results specifically, like differential diagnoses, they have been attempted as well. The truth is, I don't really follow that literature, so I think it would be wrong for me to make any grand conclusions. In terms of literally trying to do some of these same paradigms on them, I think there's some work on semantic comprehension, et cetera. But I don't know, I just don't know, maybe somebody else does, if somebody has really looked at differential diagnosis of, well, the dementia patients really can't do this language processing, but a depressed patient, as depressed as they are, can. That's certainly true. I mean, depressed patients will show those same semantic responses. And depending on stage of dementia, a dementia patient certainly won't, depending on stage. Yeah. So it's a field that's available, so to speak. Yeah.
Do you think there's any possible future application of this kind of technology to understand you're communicating with intelligent animals, like dolphins or dogs or things like that?
I don't know, but I don't know about dogs, but I know people have talked about dolphins. But I really don't know that work. And I think that would be really complex. Because it'd be a case of trying to map on the responses I showed you and then look at the responses in another species and say that's reflecting the same thing. I had a very good colleague, a friend, that I used to see at meetings, and he did infants. I think he thought of them as dolphins. That he would do very simple paradigms with them to see particular responses like I was showing up there, but very, very simple with infants. But his big issue, when I said, this is really interesting, he said, well, not as interesting as you think. He'd given a great talk, and we went out to dinner. And he said, yeah, it's not as nice as you think. He said, I'm making huge assumptions that the dip I see in the waveform in someone like you maps on functionally to the dip I see in a 2-month-old. He said, I have no faith that that's the truth. And he said, we're working on that. He said, but you know, who knows? So I think if that's within the same species, that's the rumor, infants are the same species, but nonetheless, that same species, it's that difficult, then I think crossing over that would be even tougher. Yeah. Yeah.
In regards to your autism research, how do you compensate for the fact that nonverbals and mostly autistics have an oversensory input, just as a general function? How do you compensate?
We don't. And do you mean that they don't filter the environment at all? There are so many different categories of people that have that issue. Sometimes theoretically, like some types of schizophrenia, also some types of acquired brain injury. So that we don't, because we can't make the assumption. We really don't know what's going on. So we can't make the assumption that they are overloaded. We just play the stimuli and see what happens. So, for example, you make a very fair point that the children we tested, or some of the adults, ABI, the brain injury patients that we tested, the adults, that we may not be seeing results in them simply because we're adding yet another stimulus layer to them, and they really are inhibiting and damping down the system. We don't know. One of the things that is a mantra is that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It's really true. There might be some 6th grader out there that in X years is going to say, yeah, what he did was okay, but like pretty naive. Here's the technique, you know. So it's what happens. But right now we just don't deal with that because it's an unreliable enough phenomenon. And we're trying to see if they're in there at all, let alone whether they feel a bit overwhelmed. Yeah. Good question, though. Yeah.
I wonder if you wouldn't mind making a comment about the interface device that you use. Is it like a colander with little patches that stick to the skin, or talking about acupuncture needles, or how do you get the information?
Yeah, okay. Very good point. It's non-invasive. So no needles. The electrodes are flat. They're in that bathing cap thing that was in the overhead. Oh, there's a flashback. That was in the PowerPoint. And also we do use freestanding electrodes, and we just put a paste on. It's like toothpaste, and we stick them in that just on the scalp. So it's a little bit messy, but it's absolutely non-invasive. In fact, the system we use, that was from our lab. That was not like a stock production photo. We use a type of EEG system that has the preamplifier in the electrode itself. It's really spectacular. If you've been in this business long enough, it's just changed out of all recognition. So it's got the preamp right in the electrode. So its impedance is not much of an issue. So we don't even have to. There was a time when, like when I started, when you would glue an electrode on somebody's head with airplane glue, collodion, and then the electrode had a little hole in the top, and you would take a blunted hypodermic needle. Although I said that to somebody one time, and he said, "Won't that hurt even more?" And so I said, "No, it's blunted, so it doesn't hurt." But then you would just put it in to squirt the electrolyte in there, so you have a good connection between the skin and the electrode. And then just wiggle it back and forth just to lightly like scratch the surface to get rid of any impedance. So that's the most we ever did in the sort of work I've done. Now we really don't do that because we don't need to get rid of that impedance. The way this stuff is built, it deals with it. And now the newest thing is dry electrodes. So you don't even need the electrolyte. So some people I work with are playing with that. And, oh no, they're doing serious scientific research with that. We all are. But it's very, very interesting. That's going to be really huge for things like ICU monitoring because the gel, the electrolyte dries out, you get problems in the recording, you start to see all sorts of rubbish, like Nikolai when his daughter's waking him up and everything. But it's non-invasive, and they just rest on the scalp. Does that answer your question? Yeah, okay, thanks.
What type of placement from which you record these responses? The placement in the cortex from where?
In the cortex or on the scalp? In the cortex or on the scalp?
In your scalp.
Yeah, so their scalp. So, well, we record, those caps have, some of them, I don't remember which photo that was, but have 128 sites, spread more or less evenly across. And then we look at that, that's what that topographical map that I showed, the multicolored topographical map, the different colors. Then what you do with that is you look to see what is the topography of the response that you care about. So where they come from varies depending on what you're looking at.
Well, for your test.
So that tends to be, okay. So that semantic discrepancy stuff, on the scalp, it has a distribution that is centroparietal, so it's kind of there. So toward the back of the head, with a slight right side asymmetry, very slight. And frankly, I think unreliable. So it's mostly just toward the back, not occipital, but parietal. It's diffuse. But we know where the generator is because we've used MEG. MEG and EEG together, and the generator, or generators, that's what I mean. People will say generator, there is not one, but some of the core network is in the superior temporal gyrus of the auditory cortex, and sometimes middle. We've seen areas involving Broca's, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and also Wernicke's area, angular gyrus area. So there is you can see a network involved there. So that's where the phonology and the semantic stuff happens. It's kind of cool.
Thank you very much, John.
Thank you.